Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of LingoCast, the podcast where we learn about language learning, linguistics, and how to apply all these beautiful principles in real life. Today, we've got a very special guest, Dr. Janis Nuckolls.
Thank you for being with us.
Hey, thanks so much for inviting me. This is a real privilege.
Absolutely. So, could you start by telling us how you would define linguistics?
Oh my gosh, yeah, there's so many different ways of being a linguist. I emphasize that a lot in my classes. For me, a linguist is somebody who is interested in language of any kind. Somebody who's interested in scientific approaches to language, humanistic approaches to language, cultural approaches to language, etc.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely encompasses kind of a wide spectrum,
It does.
but all related to language.
Yeah.
And how did you get involved in linguistics? How did you start? How have your interests kind of developed as you've been in the field?
Well, thanks for asking. It's been a kind of a zigzaggy path.
Really?
I started out wanting to be an artist. I went to 2 different art schools after I graduated from high school.
Wow.
My special interest was in visual arts, especially in filmmaking. And then I kind of had this, I had a crisis of some kind, and I realized I don't know how to express myself with film, and it seemed to me that when we were talking about films that we would make and we would critique each other's films and talk about them with each other in this art school that I went to, language was always something we needed. And I thought, well, in my naive, 20-ish something way, I thought maybe language is superior to film. And so, or maybe I just wasn't cut out to be an artist. And so I went to college and I got a degree. And linguistics really snagged my interest because I always loved language, but I was taking a course in Sanskrit and I couldn't understand anything about the language.
Yeah.
The professor tried to teach it, but she said, take a linguistics course. And so I did, and that was the best advice I ever got. So
Cool.
then I became really just so fascinated by all aspects of. I've always loved language. Apparently I was a very verbal child, and they couldn't get me to stop talking. So I've always loved language. I love literature, and I tried different majors in comparative literature and Greek and anthropology and sociology, and finally I just settled on linguistics. So I got an undergrad, master's, and a PhD in linguistics. That's how I kind of settled in. Yeah.
Amazing.
And what would you say is the most misunderstood aspect of the linguistics field that people misunderstand when you say linguistics?
Oh my gosh, we have our work cut out for us as linguists. I think our job, at least half of our job, is to educate people about what linguistics really is, because there's so many misunderstandings from, thinking that we're the only ones who really know how to speak correctly to we're the ones who speak languages, by the dozens, and they're all easy for us to learn, and we're just, we're just that way. Those are the 2 most basic misunderstandings. But also, I think more deeply, we need to think, in terms of educating people about the limits of language and what can and what cannot be expressed. There's this saying among people who are very outdoorsy. They say things like, "The more you know, the less you carry." Right? Sometimes I think the less you say, the more you know.
Interesting.
So I don't want to, come down against language or anything, but
Yeah.
sometimes that's just the case.
And I have a question. So you do linguistic anthropology.
Right.
So first of all, explain a little bit about your work in linguistic anthropology. What is that, and how do both blend in together? And what's the difference between just linguistics and anthropology? How do you combine these fields?
That's a great question. Thank you. These are all so fun to talk about. Well, first of all, linguistics has always been a subfield of anthropology. Anthropology is the encompassing discipline that arose first, and language study was part of it. And that was how Franz Boas, the leading founding father of the field of anthropology, defined our relationship to the discipline. Anthropology began as cultural, sociocultural, biological, physical, and linguistic. So we were just a branch of anthropology.
Interesting.
So it makes sense to me that anthropological linguistics seems like a natural natural fit. Linguistics seems really at home in anthropology.
Yeah.
And in fact, I had a professor in graduate school who passed away recently, Howard Aronson. He was a professor in the Slavics department at Chicago, and he, when people would describe themselves as sociolinguists, he would say all linguistics is sociolinguistic. There's no such thing as linguistics that isn't sociolinguistic.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I guess to get to your question more directly, for me, anthroling is a look at the ways in which different ways of looking at the world and grammars and cultures all kind of collide with each other sometimes.
Can you give us more depth inside of that, what you've seen in terms?
Sure. So just studying with Kichwa people in Ecuador, it's so interesting because I take students down there on study abroads, and part of our coursework is to interview students in this language. So once they know just a little bit of this Kichwa language, they start asking questions of our consultants.
Right.
And a common question, a common strategy for getting to know another person in our culture is, what's your favorite food, or what's the scariest thing that you ever went through? And that's what students will try to do with my Quechua-speaking consultants, and they come up against a wall because
Really?
they don't have this scalar view of reality where something is the most. They can say something is more than something else. But to say something is absolutely the most scary, the most delicious, the most favorite, there's no way to say that in their language. You have to use Spanish.
Interesting.
So that's really peculiar.
And this is interesting. This is kind of like one of the things that we're very curious about.
Yeah.
How does it, from what you've seen, your personal experience with the Kichwa people and also other studies you've done, how does this worldview contrast with our Western worldview? Because I mean, these questions like what's your favorite food, what do you like to do, what you want to do when you grow up, these questions usually come up mostly in Western contexts.
Yes,
I'm talking about Western, mean like Western European languages, Portuguese, Spanish, Euro-American, South American. But how does this worldview contrast with the Kichwa people in other cultures you've seen?
Yeah, so really lovely question. The Kichwa people that I'm most comfortable interacting with, and the ones that I know best, are people who are maybe older generation people that I met in dissertation fieldwork days. And one of the things that's always struck me is that their culture, the way they're encouraged to speak, it's a very empathetic, heartful way of speaking.
How?
It's not a way of speaking that privileges exhibiting knowledge, which is what our culture really does emphasize, the ability to exhibit knowledge. From childhood onwards, we teach children to tell us stories about what they've just been through so they can learn how to create narrative accounts of reality. And if they make a mistake, we sometimes correct them and we say, no, remember we went there first and then we went there. So in Kichwa culture, exhibiting knowledge doesn't have that value. They often, in fact, they're very embarrassed to say I don't know.
Really?
Yeah, but they say I don't know in a very different way than
How?
we do. So, for example, if somebody ask me a question, ask me any kind of yes/no question.
Is the weather nice today?
Yeah.
This is how a Kichwa person would answer. First of all, here's how an English speaker like me would answer. I would say something like, I don't know if the weather's, I don't know, I haven't been outside. A Kichwa speaker would say, is the weather nice today? I wish I knew, I don't know. So they'll repeat the question as if it's their question too. Like they really want to know. Because if they just say, I don't know, it sort of cuts off further dialogue.
But
interesting.
Because normally here in the West, when we say I don't know, a lot of times is also blended with the idea of I don't care.
Yes.
I don't know it, I don't care.
Yes.
But how does that contrast with the Kichwa? They care.
It's their job to care about how other people navigate their way through the world and to help them. If you just say I don't know, it sounds very cold.
Really?
And yeah. So you repeat the question as if it's your question too. And then you say, I don't know. We, by contrast, would say something like, I don't know, but I could check the weather report on my phone for you. So we feel like it's our job to know things, right?
Right.
And to inform people.
And
Yeah.
I've also seen that sometimes we want to, when the person say you don't know, you also want to, I would say, inform them of something.
Yeah.
Or sometimes like by the way, do you know that you're not asking if the person actually knows.
Yeah.
You actually want to tell them about something.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
By the way,
Like, have you heard of this thing?
by the way, have you heard of this thing? Did you
And
know
you're
that
about to tell them.
you're about to tell them?
Yeah.
You're about, so they don't do, you're about to begin a conversation. So the Kichwa people don't do that. They don't.
Not so much, no.
Not so much.
And in fact, they are comfortable with periods of silence that we wouldn't be comfortable
Really?
with. Yeah.
How come? Can you give me some examples of that?
So, for example, there was a husband and wife that I knew pretty well, and he had gone away to work in a distant city just to make money for his family, because this is a remote village where they were living, and there weren't many opportunities to make money. So after 3 months, he came back, and so they live in like open air houses with thatched roofs, no walls, dirt floor, just kind of support beams holding the roofs in place. And her husband one day, he just walked into the house and sat down, and I said, "Dina, that's your husband." She said, "I know." I said, "Well, aren't you going to run up to him and hug him or anything?" And she just laughed. She thought that was so funny.
Really?
So she just busily got ready to give him, something to drink, because he'd been away for a while. Their choice beverage is something made from the yucca plant, so she was getting that ready for him. And I didn't really understand. I asked her that, and she laughed, and she said, "What do you think I should do, hug him?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Would you do that?" And I said, "Of course." And she thought that was so funny. People talked about that for weeks.
Really?
Yeah. And I didn't understand that until recently when I read an article by Keith Basso called, it's an article about not speaking in Western Apache culture. I can't recall the name of it. To give up on words. Okay. And Basso argues that for Western Apache people, when people have been away for a long time, especially school children who've been bussed off to schools and they've been away from their parents for a year, when they come back to visit, the parents don't say a word, maybe not even for 2 or 3 days, because they don't know what kind of a child they're dealing with. They don't know who the child is.
Oh, wow.
And so there's no stance that they know how to address the child. Did the child have a good time? Does the child think that our ways are bad now? Did the teachers make the child feel that the child came from an inferior language and culture?
Interesting.
So the parents don't know exactly what kind of a child has come back to them. So they wait, and they slowly, reacquaint themselves. It's as if, part of the child has died, and they have to reacquaint themselves with a new version of the child.
And so you're saying that this would be applied in Ecuador with the Kichwa people?
Yeah, it would indeed.
But the husband was out for how long?
3
day?
months.
3 months, and then he came back. It's like, interesting.
Yeah, so she does. I'm pretty convinced that she felt that it was appropriate and respectful to give him space to reacclimate to his familiar village life, and she also wanted to reacclimate to this husband who had been gone for so long for her.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So this is what we don't understand about. So you have examples from other cultures too, like stuff that you've seen, like whoa, interesting.
Well, the Western Apache is the most vivid example that comes to mind. Even courtship is different for them than us. For example, you're getting to know somebody, you don't speak and you don't tell everybody things. You just sit in silence for long periods of time.
Wow.
You might even start holding hands before you actually speak and tell that person.
Interesting.
Yeah. That's coming to mind first and foremost. Yeah. But there's other things about Kichwa culture that surprise people too.
So I wonder, from what I've heard about your experiences, it's not necessarily always comfortable or easy to get to these communities of people, to live among these communities of people, not in terms interpersonal, but just practically, logistically difficult to. And you've carried out research in Ecuador for many years. What kind of challenges have you faced, and what drives you to continue to go down there, do research? What's kind of motivating you?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking. So for me, I just love Kichwa speakers. I had a lot of difficulties at first, just navigating myself to get to their territories. I would have to charter small planes to get there.
Right.
And then I would land there with limited supplies, and people were so kind to me. They were so nice, and even though they have no formal education, they're some of the smartest people I know. They know how to live. They know how to be happy with very little. They know how to, if our supply chains were cut off, we would be pretty lost.
Yeah.
They don't have to rely on supply chains the way we do. If they
Yes.
have a machete, they can pretty much do what they need to do. In fact, a friend of mine
Right.
once said, a Kichwa lady said, as long as I have a machete, I won't die in the forest. That's all I need. Because they know their environment so well.
Right.
But trials that I've faced were, just the practical things like never feeling like you have any privacy. People watch you and they scrutinize you constantly
Really?
when you're in that kind of a setting.
Wow.
No privacy. They watch you. They watch you get up in the morning when you're not ready for, social interaction.
Yeah.
They get up in the middle of the night and say, "Hey, come on, let's go urinate together." Because it's dangerous to do that in the deep part of the rainforest.
I imagine.
Be grabbed by a jaguar or bitten by a snake. So they all do a lot of things together that we would consider private matters.
Interesting.
Really?
Yeah.
And this is all applies and this all obviously affects their language too.
I mean, I think in some ways it really does because it's a very well, what did you have in mind by this affects their language?
But maybe like the way they speak, the grammar, for example. Would you? Because we love language learning, right? And we normally have a set idea of what language learning is like, all the rules and stuff.
Yes.
Would there be, for example, you can conjugate this in Kichwa? Would that be appropriate? Not appropriate? It's like, or it would be something like, I was like, yes, I understand. They probably understand what you're saying, but a Kichwa person would never say that. Like, would they're like how like do things like that occur often?
You mean do they learn language the same way we do, or do they teach language the same to their children?
In a way, like if I were to learn Kichwa, what in my mind would have changed for me to speak, to be considered like, oh, you speak Kichwa very well.
Okay. First of all, you have to realize that when you speak Kichwa, you're always expressing something from a perspective. And you can't just, like in linguistics, we talk about generic statements, like these impersonal, the kind of statements that you hear in a documentary film. Like, my favorite example is something I heard about emperor penguins, which the narrator was saying, the male of the species guards the eggs, A Kichwa speaker would never say that. They would say something like, well, from my perspective, it's the case that the male guards the eggs. Or according to my grandfather's perspective, the male is the one who always guards the eggs. So
Interesting.
you have to perspectivize your statements,
Really?
number one, to speak fluently, to speak well.
Interesting.
You have to, you also have to use a lot of speech reports. So you know how in English, we have all these verbs like to complain, to explain, to criticize. In Kichwa, what they do is they would say something like, saying you shouldn't have gone there, John said. So instead of saying John scolded his child for going there, they would say, saying you shouldn't have gone there, John said to his child. So you use speech reports a lot, and that's another way of representing another person's perspective. And then you make the inference that somebody was scolded just by the intonation that they use when they say that.
Oh.
Yeah.
So here's coming in the next section. You have done studies a lot on ideophones.
Yes.
What is an ideophone, first of all?
Okay, so an idiophone or an ideophone.
Ideophone or idiophone? How?
Either. An idiophone is a word that uses perhaps special sounds or special intonational patterns, possibly often accompanied by gestures, to express the immediacy of a sensory experience, whether it's visual, auditory, proprioceptives, a feeling inside your body, or visual. Did I say visual? Okay,
Yeah.
I meant to say visual. So a comparable name for them is onomatopoeic words in English. But I mean, people often think of onomatopoeic words as very simple words that simply imitate like animal sounds. And linguists from African traditions have called them ideophones. There are onomatopoeic words in English that are complex. Like if you say a word like crash, it's not just the sound. It's something about a physical impact and maybe a visual sensation of things scattering at the same time. It's a polysensory kind of.
So in a way, like for example, I'm thinking of in comic books. right?
Yes.
Like
Yes.
like comic books. I've seen differences between. I read comic books in Portuguese and in English,
Yes.
where in English it would say smash,
Yes.
or in Portuguese say "pau,"
Nice, nice.
or like kind of like the when you would an example of ideophone be like when you're making gun sound in English you say like pew 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 pew, like in Portuguese like pa 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 pa.
Yeah. And
Okay.
in Kichwa, it's tau tau tau.
Tao tao. Oh,
Yeah,
true.
yeah, yeah.
So how does here's one thing that I've always been curious about. How does this develop in a language? Because I can here's a very quick example between Portuguese and Spanish. The rooster, right? The rooster in English says cock-a-doodle-doo. In Portuguese, say cocoricó. But in Spanish, they say kikiriki. But how like even in two very similar languages, they already differ. They differ. How does how does the phonological say brain of the person process like, hey, this sounds like this, and how does the whole culture agree to that?
Wow, that's not a small question.
No, it's not. It's not because I'm fascinated, because I'm curious, fascinated by that.
So my perspective on this, I guess I'm trying to sound like a Quechua speaker. I think these words are universal. They're an open class, so they're somewhat creatively adaptive. You can invent new ones on the fly. They do follow templates in Quechua. I've studied the way in which they're structured. They tend to use sounds that are either they'll take a marked sound from the normal lexicon, so-called, and then they'll use that sound like crazy. Like in Quechua, palatalized consonants are kind of unusual.
What's a palatalized consonant?
So like pia,
Pia.
like a p, like you're trying to say a consonant and a y sound at the same time, like pia, tia, kia.
Pia.
So in regular non-idiophonic Quechua, there's just 2 or 3 words that have that sound. Well, in ideophones, they run rampant. Okay?
Interesting.
And so if there's any kind of a marginalized sound or syllable structure or morphological pattern that's marked, ideophones will take it and run with it. They systematically stretch the structure of the regular lexicon in really interesting and principled ways. How they develop, I don't know, but lately I've been thinking of ideophones as a kind of a way of speaking that has an analogy with gesture, because we like to say that ideophones show rather than tell about. So in semantics we talk about descriptive meaning. John explained how to grab the turtle, but a showy way of saying that would be John saying, hold it with both hands in the middle of his stomach, John said. So that's more of depictive, right? Because you're depicting the actual words spoken. And ideophones are also depictive. They show rather than tell about sensory perceptions. Yeah. So and gestures do the same thing. Gestures are also depictive. So ideophones partner with gestures in many languages.
Really?
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah.
So you say that so you think that so to learn, I'll say, to understand a language, learn language, and sound like it as if you're good at it. So you're saying that gestures play a role too? Please.
Well, they do for Quechua people, and I actually think they do for everybody. But what I wanted to say also was that I think the urge to show and rather than just tell about is something we see even among ourselves nowadays. I mean, how many times have you taken out your iPhone or whatever to show somebody a picture of something? You don't just want to tell them about it, right? So it seems like it's almost this urge that we have to present rather than just tell about.
Interesting.
Yeah. So anyway, but back to your question, could you?
No, well, like
ask it again,
normal,
'cause I think I went on a digression.
because when we learn language, we often only think about the structure, the grammar, the pronunciation, but we never take into account the biases that involve body language. Like an example of that would be missionaries, English speakers going to Brazil, and stereotypically we use the gestures a lot. We're very energetic in our speech. We speak very loudly. And normally, from what I've seen is, you can get your average Portuguese speakers, and you get someone who's like talks very, very quietly, very this and that, and even though they have a good accent, they still don't have the body language that show that they belong to that culture. And I've seen like, hey, which one has a better Portuguese? Like that guy sounds like more not only Brazilian, but he also corresponds to the body language of someone of his age. Of someone of his age, someone of his probably that region, and he has simply the body language, what they could the flair, as we like to say.
Yes.
So do you think that plays a big role too?
That is so important. I think there's a history of regarding gesture as somehow more primitive and not rational.
Huh.
Now the Romans, classical Roman times were different because oratory was valued, and they would write treatises on how to use gesture appropriately to communicate well. But our society has become increasingly, dominated by rationality and the Enlightenment, and we have a very cerebral view, a cerebral-centric view of language as in the brain rather than embodied. And there are a lot of people who think that gesture wasn't a primitive form of language. And that at first all humans used gesture, and then we evolved into the more sophisticated language, so-called. My view is different. I think that language and gesture probably have always coexisted. I think language and gesture are partners with each other. We tend to view language, there are a lot of biological analogies that we borrow when we talk about language, and language evolution and language relatedness. But I've been reading this great book,
you even brought it.
Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake. And it has opened my eyes so much to, he's a scientist of fungal forms of life, but he writes for a general audience. And this book has raised so many questions for me about what a system is, how do we even talk about systems? And language is, of course, a system, right? At least we talk about it as a system. He talks about the evolution of fungal forms of life. He talks about how important it's been, for example, for some forms of life, like lichens. Okay, so lichens are some of the oldest forms of life on the planet. Lichens are extremophiles. They've sent them into outer space, and they can't be destroyed. They've survived nuclear explosions.
Wow.
But they evolved because they combined with algae and fungi together, as well as some bacteria, according to this book. And so they partnered with each other to create a greater capacity organism. And I actually think language and gesture are like that. I think they partner with each other, right? We tend to look at things in this linear way, like, well, this was, this diachronic way. So first they had this, then we had this. But this book also points out that there's such a thing called parallel, he calls it parallel evolution, where different organisms can exchange DNA with each other and join forces together. Not any DNA that's inherited, but they can actually change. They can change in a synchronic, in a synchronic way. We talk about diachronic and synchronic, right? Historical linguistics and the linguistics of the present day structure of the language.
Yeah.
Well, evolution can also happen in real time. And I think, to look at gesture as a primitive form of language or overly expressive or stigmatize it as too emotional is a big mistake.
It is. I definitely can empathize with the idea of gestures being part of culture, because I told Sophie about this as it was these Brazilian series that where they was on Netflix and went to IMDb to see the reviews and
sorry, what's IMDb?
IMDb is like where they review movies and series and all that.
Okay.
And a lot of the Americans, they were rating it low. It was like, oh yeah, this totally sounds unrealistic. Oh yeah, the way they reacted here, the way they use like this body language, they overreact, they do that. It was like
exaggerated.
They exaggerated, and I just laughed at like they're not exaggerated. We actually do all of that.
You guys talk. Well, I mean, to bring it, even into an even more like readily observable domain. I was doing an exercise with my class yesterday, having them go to YouTube and find just little videos of interactions between people and then analyze them with semantic concepts. And when I got to the YouTube screen, something just came up that was so intriguing. It was a Saturday Night Live episode called Unlikely Couples. And it was hysterical. They had a man who was speaking in a sort of a light African American vernacular variety, and then they had a woman who was speaking in a very so-called standard way in English. And it was obvious that the man was being really laughed at, or the combination was laughed at. The contrast was laughed at,
Right.
but the man was especially portrayed as a kind of a buffoon because he was gesturing wildly. He was using ideophones. He was saying he had his girlfriend recite a very erudite poem because she was doing a master's degree from Barnard on 18th century graveyards, and so she recited this very really like elegia, really kind of a lyrical poem in standard English, and while she's reciting it, he's uttering these ideophones like bam, and like making all these wild gestures, and just wow, and he was obviously being portrayed as a caricature of a human being because he was gesturing a lot and he was using ideophones and he was very spontaneous and emotional.
Interesting.
Right? And that's a caricature of a human being. But a lot of people do speak with a lot of expressivity and gesture. Why should they be stigmatized?
Absolutely. It often adds to what they're trying to communicate.
Well,
it
they're
helps
often
us
really
understand.
likable people too. It's easy to like people like that, and that portrayal, I think, it really pokes fun at that kind of a human being. At the same time that it makes it seem like very complimentary. I don't know. You'll have to watch it.
In a way, I think from what you're saying is that we Westerners, in a way, we kind of got the human tendency to display sensory things through symbolism and kind of stigmatize it or throw it under the bus, like, oh yeah, this is useless. Oh, we don't do that. But in reality, we're denying since even public speakers, they say, hey, use these gestures. They convey this, they convey that. Like you do this, you have a meaning. And sometimes I can even tell different cultures by the way they use gestures. Right. Like I think I told you that before, that I've seen a lot of Brazilians, they do this gesture here. It's like when they will try to make a point, it's like this. Let me tell you something. I heard that So
what are you doing with your thumb? I want to learn how to do this. Oh, like an okay symbol. But
like they're like kind of like they're making their point straight.
Oh, okay.
Nice. They're making their point straight, or
You do that a lot.
Do I?
Yes.
or the stereotypical Italian hand thing.
Yeah.
So that would be because do you think that in a way I've seen in arts in acting, so you know a little bit of that, them telling that like, hey, you do this, you automatically sound more Italian. Does that make you sound, or is this because you associate with that, with the whole stereotype that it affects your, I'll say, you start to associate with that, so you sound more like that? Do you think that has a role in that?
You said, are you asking me if I think the use of certain gestures?
Yes, will kind of affect your brain. Your brain's like, okay, I'm in this mode, so I need to sound like this because I'm using.
Why wouldn't it? I mean, Paul Ekman, the facial recognition specialist, the facial muscle recognition specialist, has said that when we smile, it actually affects our brain waves in positive ways. Smiling is a gesture that does affect our physiology.
Interesting.
So, yeah, it is fascinating. So why wouldn't gestures also affect us in other ways?
Yeah.
Interesting. Oh, I wanted to ask you about that. This was not a part of the question thing. So I was doing some simultaneous interpretation. A couple.
ASL?
No.
Brazilian?
English to Portuguese.
Okay.
No, Portuguese and English actually.
Okay.
And in one of the speakers, he was telling a story. He was telling like something that happened to him. But then he was teaching something. But then he's like, but then you asked me, how did I do that? But he was actually putting himself in the role of the person asking and answering his own question.
So like a little mini dialogue.
Kind of mini dialogue, but then he was doing that. But my brother, I'm telling you, how do you do that? But it's like, don't worry, I'll tell you. And he was like, but don't worry, I'm gonna. And he was telling the story as if the audience had a question, asking a question, then responding to the very question. And I've seen a lot of people doing that, especially in courses. But like I was watching a financial self-reliance course by a Brazilian guy, he was given like, so here's what you need to do to be self-reliant. But then he asked me, but Hamidu, how do I get all my bills straight if I don't get enough? But I'm gonna tell you.
I love that.
So you have seen things like that?
That's very polyvocal. It's very Kichwa too, because
Really?
Kichwa people will often say things like, "Well, you might ask me now, why did I go into the forest late at night by myself?" Well, I'll tell you, right? And then they'll answer their own question. So that's examples of using speech reports, and it strikes you maybe as a little bit odd.
Yeah, because I wasn't I do that a lot, but the thing is I wasn't aware because I only became aware because I was simultaneously translating. It was like wait, and in my head it's like wait, we don't do that in English.
Yeah. And I'm still kind of struggling with why speech reports, quoted speech, are and I don't want to say stigmatized, but they're considered kind of colloquial and not exactly erudite and not exactly formal. Why is that? Because Quechua speakers really do use them a lot. And I've talked to native Quechua speakers who, well, there's a woman with an unusual background. She's trilingual in English, Quechua, and Spanish. She was, partly raised in Ecuador, partly in the U.S. Her dad's a professor at ASU. And she said that speech reports give a certain sparkle to the language. And if you don't use them, your language is somehow flatter. But more flat. She's intimidated to use them in front of older Quechua people because she's always afraid she's going to get it wrong. There's a skill involved in using them, and it's considered hyper-fluent Quechua, like by many people.
Interesting.
So why are speech reports considered? Why are they so un-Englishy?
Yeah.
That's what I'm curious about.
I
really don't completely know.
I think that normally I don't know if that's Portuguese too, or if it's just we have a lot of influence from natives. I don't know if that came from the Brazilian natives who used that type of language and then somehow it was incorporated into storytelling Portuguese.
Into mainstream Portuguese.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of things from Tupi languages that managed to get into Portuguese. There's a lot of lexicon and I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of that came into the language too. But I haven't seen European Portuguese to see if they have that or not.
Yeah, it could be that in earlier forms of Portuguese,
maybe
speech reports are more common.
Sure.
A colleague of mine has said that Emily Dickinson, when she in her early novels, would incorporate speech reports as part of her style. But then in her later novels, she toned it down and she kind of like got rid of a lot of them, and it's considered her mature style. I think it's considered more complex syntactically to say something like, because when you don't do a speech report and you turn it into an indirect speech report, you have to do certain deictic shifts and things like that. And so maybe people think that's more syntactically complex and interesting rather than the bare bones of what somebody's actually saying. And then maybe they think, well, that's kind of primitive to just say what they said. Yeah. That's just, we also have a prejudice in our culture against imitation and repetition.
Really?
Why should we repeat? Oh, yeah. It's considered simple-minded, right? Simple-minded imitation, right? And that's one reason ideophones, I think, are looked down on, because they're imitative. But anyway, I do think that, there's something going on here with the stigmatization of imitativeness, because after all, it goes against the Gricean maxim of...
What's a Gricean maxim?
Gricean maxim is it's a set of cooperative principles that we are all believed to follow.
In the West.
Supposed to be universal.
Supposed to be universal, okay.
Supposed to be universal.
But it's not.
We're supposed to be, you could say that it is, but in different ways for every culture. So, there's the maxim of brevity. Don't say more than you need to say. Repetitiveness violates that brevity. When you use an idiophone to imitate an ongoing sensory perception, like an armadillo snoring. I bet you don't know how an armadillo snores sounds.
Yeah, that's kind of like that song, What Does a Fox Say? I have no idea what a fox sounds like.
So according to my sources, an armadillo snoring goes shoon, shoon, shoon. So there we have it, repetition. Why should you repeat it over and over again? Well, because it makes it more expressive, right?
Yeah.
The philosopher of semantics, Christopher Potts, has written an essay on expressive language, and he says that expressive language repetition is fine with expressive language in a way that it's not fine with regular language. So if you say like, darn, I left my darn keys in the darn car. Every time you say the word darn, it adds an extra element of expressivity and
Right.
emotionality. But if you repeat yourself in normal language, it's considered repetitive, right?
Right.
So anyway, so I think repetitiveness is involved in the stigmatization of speech reports in our culture. Stigmatization is a little bit strong, but they're kind of considered substandard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As well as ideophones and other kinds of,
Yeah, because I think in a way that we, as Westerners, we got the idea of imitation as mockery, but not as like something,
as well too,
but not like something
Yeah.
as beautiful. Because I follow a different thing. I think the imitation is beautiful. Something I like to do is imitate accents.
Yeah.
I love imitating accents, and sometimes when I'm talking to someone, it just unconsciously comes to me where I just start talking like them.
What's your favorite accent to imitate? Do you have one, Sophie?
I do.
I can do. Well, I can like speak English with a French accent.
Ooh,
Which
oui,
is
oui. What about you, Philippe?
Well, listen to me. I have many accents I like to imitate. First is a Cockney person would never think I'm a Cockney, eh? But this is an accent I can do. Another one.
Oh, that's
And
wonderful.
another one I like to do is when I do the Brazilian accent. When there's when I want to say when there's a situation where like I know it would be inappropriate if I were to speak English, so I act as if I didn't know English, and I'll go to the person and ask like, oh, what do you ask about something totally random, I think they would be okay with me doing that if they see that my English is not good and I only spoke Portuguese.
It's strategic.
Portuguese is strategic.
That's
And also, as I like to imitate the in a way the Spanish. Although I don't speak Spanish, I have a very close relation with the Spanish language. It's not something I have to think. I have to get the patterns in my mind and then see how they would do. Like it's not. It's kind of like I really enjoy doing those, and I kind of feel like in a way with certain people, it's like, oh, you shouldn't be doing that. It's like why not? It's fun.
It's playing.
It's playing.
around
It's
with language.
playing. I love playing around with language. That's one of my passions, right? About language learning is that you get to play with these ideas, with like this imagery, and I think it's just a pity that we got that and threw that out. We threw that out the window in language learning because I think it's essential for you to like. Yeah, these people sound like that. I was like, it's like they say like, oh, it's bad. It's like, what's so bad about speaking a certain way? What?
If you're trying to sound like them.
If you're trying to sound like them,
to
you know what?
imitate to some
And
extent.
also intonation is such an important part of language. And we don't
Intonation.
even have it as a module of language in our standard models, right? We have phonetics, phonology, syntax, semantics, pragmatics, intonation.
Intonation.
What happened to intonation, right?
Yeah.
Because it's syntactic, it's semantic, it's a lot of things.
Very interesting.
It's musical
Yeah.
to some extent, expressive. Yeah. Wow.
Well, thank you so much
Thank
for
you so much.
taking the time we covered a lot of things, and you have had such interesting experiences, and you have so much knowledge, and we're so grateful that you would share some of that with us.
Gosh, thank you so much for inviting me to have so much fun.
Absolutely.
And talk about things that are so interesting.
Yeah, this is very helpful for language learning. If you want to learn a new language, make sure you analyze you're not going to find that in textbooks. Most likely, probably linguistic textbooks with full of complicated terminology that you probably won't understand. So a way to do that is just analyze how people speak and don't be afraid to imitate them. Sometimes they'll appreciate it.
Beautiful. I love that. Yeah.
So,
Thank you so much.
And Dr. Nuckolls, where can we find you?
Where can you find me?
Where can we find you? Like if you have a website, if you have a social media, if you post things.
You can find me. Let's see. I have a website for that the university puts out. But I also have an archive of ideophones called Quechua Real Words.
Quechua Real Words.
Yeah, so you can find my work there. That would be even more interesting than just finding me. But it's called quechuarealwords.byu.edu, and you can see how fascinating ideophones are. It's a wonderful site where you can look up ideophones by the sensory modality or by by just listed them in alphabetical order. Every ideophone has its own page, and you can scroll down and see all the usages of ideophones.
So cool.
Yeah.
We can put that link in the description.
Yeah, please, put it in. Yeah.
Awesome.
So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you guys are awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.